Strategic planning during the Eisenhower administration placed much greater emphasis on a submarine's ability to go deep, very deep, during the burgeoning Cold War at sea between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Hence, interest was high in diving to and operating at greater depths when the Permit-class boats started coming into service in the early 1960s. The loss of the Thresher in 1963 was a major blow to the silent service. The basic design was sound, but there had not been careful consideration of the operational hazards of traveling to such depths. The Greenling nearly suffered the same fate as the Thresher almost exactly 10 years later. On a training expedition in deep ocean waters about 250 miles northwest of Bermuda in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, she was conducting some deep dive testing of her own. Specifically, she was testing the efficacy of torpedo launches at test depth. The date was 27 March 1973. The commanding officer, Commander William T. Johnson, was in the torpedo room as one of several water slugs was fired during the exercise. Johnson was alarmed when he noticed that the reading on a pressure gauge on the torpedo tube was significantly higher than normal. Troubled by what he saw, Johnson asked his chief torpedoman, when was the last time this gauge was calibrated? The chief replied that he thought that the last calibration had recently been completed during PMs, preventive maintenance, shortly before leaving the harbor. As somewhat of a mathematical savant, Johnson realized the broader implication of the unexpectedly high pressure reading on this single gauge. His boat was much deeper than it should be. Normally, depth measurements were read at the ship's control panel, SCP, in the forward part of the control room, where the plainsman and helmsman navigated the ship, while the DOOW, diving officer of the watch, supervised just behind them. At that time, both digital and analog gauges were used to determine depth. The navigation crew had chosen to use only the digital gauge for the day's exercises. Unbeknownst to everyone in control, the analog depth gauge was not working. It had been valved off during PMs, and the valve was still closed. Johnson called up to control from the torpedo room and asked the OOD, officer of the deck, what the depth gauges were showing. Only then did the OOD realize that the analog depth gauge was not functioning. When he activated it, the needle shot up to an alarming value, well in excess of test depth and reasonably close to the theoretical collapse depth. The digital pressure gauge was apparently way off, and the Greenling was in serious danger. Johnson scrambled back to control just as the OOD was issuing an order for a steep up bubble, intended to tilt the bow of the submarine up by adjusting the angle on the stern planes, and thence driving the boat to shallower depths. The term up bubble comes from the position of the bubble on the ship's clinometer. This was the usual way to ascend. Submarines rarely blew their tanks at depth, to keep from shooting to the surface like a cork. But Johnson was wary of such a maneuver at the boat's great depth. He was concerned that an up bubble would cause the stern of the submarine to squat deeper still, with a corresponding increase in pressure that might already be dangerously close to rupturing pipes or collapsing the hull itself. Because of the sheer length of the submarine, almost the length of a football field, a 15 to 20 degree up bubble could push the stern down another 100 feet or so. Thinking quickly, Johnson countermanded his OOD's order. Instead, he ordered a slower ascent with near-neutral trim, bringing the entire submarine upwards to a lower sea pressure uniformly. There were more than the usual number of creaks and groans. Perhaps such sounds were so commonplace to the experienced sailor that they normally went unnoticed. But at the depth that the Greenling had descended to before Johnson's epiphany, those noises may have taken on a new and frightening significance as the ascent commenced. The crew members held their collective breath as the Greenling crept back to a safe depth. Moving too quickly was a bad idea, since the steep pressure gradients accompanying a rapid ascent would place added stress on the pressure hull. Assuming that the hull was already highly vulnerable to failure, C.O. Johnson took every precaution to move toward the surface with a deliberate and measured pace. Once safely back at operating depth, the boat commenced normal surfacing procedures. After reaching a depth of about